Shabbat Shalom, everyone. So it's amazing. It was just a week ago that we bore witness to one of the most spectacular failures of moral leadership that we have seen in a long time, well, maybe not in a long time, in our society. And of course, I'm talking about the impeachment vote in the Senate, where there was rock solid, irrefutable evidence that the 45th president incited a seditious mob, and yet a majority of the Senate voted not to impeach for presumably reasons for political expediency. That is very much a failure of moral and ethical leadership. So the question that I would like us to explore today is, what do we do when we live in a world and in a society where leaders are failing to make right and just decisions based upon moral compass and moral sensibilities? What do we do about that? You know, Judaism, fortunately, unfortunately, has a lot to say about this reality, because this isn't our first rodeo. We've been through thousands of years of experiencing people, leaders who fail us morally, sometimes in incredibly horrible, violent, and criminal ways. I'm speaking now, of course, the typology of Parshat Zachor. We're reading in the Maftir that Steve chanted for us, the words, Zachor et asher asa lecha Amalek. Remember what Amalek did to you on your journey after you left Egypt. How undeterred by fear of God, he surprised you on the march when you were famished and weary and cut down all the stragglers in your rear. Therefore, when the Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you in the land that the Lord your God is giving you as a hereditary portion, timche et zecher Amalek. Wipe out the memory of Amalek, mitachat hashamayim, from beneath the heavens, lo tishkach, don't forget. Powerful and paradoxic command there. So what is Amalek? Amalek, as I mentioned before, becomes the typology of the eternal enemy of Israel, the eternal enemy of the Jewish people. Why? Because just as the Maftir explained, they had genocidal plans. They didn't do standard warfare. They attacked our women and children who were hungry and weary in the rear of the processing Israelites. They were out to destroy us. So they stand eternally as that enemy of Israel. What's interesting is our rabbinic tradition extends the meaning of Amalek and extends it to a much broader understanding of what Amalek means. If we think of the role of the Jewish people in the world as to be kind of an instrument of God by which we can bring all people, Bayom Hahu Yadonai Echad U'Shemo Echad, all people one day to unity in justice, in righteousness, and in holiness. If that's our role in the world, then Amalek is always that in humanity which stands opposed to that movement toward unity of all human beings. Amalek in the rabbinic tradition becomes broadened and spiritualized to represent all impulses to division within human beings, all impulses to undermine human commonality, right? It represents that impulse when people selfishly want to hold power for themselves at the expense of others. And by holding power for themselves, they are taking the power which rightfully belongs to God in the plan of creating unity for all human beings and all life on earth. I really love that this is where Judaism went with the meaning of Amalek. It resonates very much with me, and it should resonate with all of us as a symbol of our times, right? Amalek is not only the enemies of Israel. Amalek is not only the things that we can very immediately identify as genocide. Amalek is anything in our human experience that sets us on the path toward division and toward evil, right? It was Martin Luther King who pointed out that the end result of all racism and bigotry, no matter how small the gesture of racism and bigotry is, the end degree, it all leads back to one place, which is genocide. So that means that any little thing, when people refuse to act even though others are being threatened or hurt, that is Amalek. When senators refuse to convict somebody who has irrefutable evidence that they've done something criminal, this too is the dimension of Amalek still alive in this world. This idea gets further developed in the Haftarah that Janet so beautifully chanted for us today. We are reading the story of King Shaul, who was commanded by God to do war with the Amalekites, with Amalek, and to completely wipe them out, to completely destroy every single one of them, once and for all. And what the Haftarah attests to is that Shaul failed. They won. They routed Amalek, but he himself refused to kill Agag, the Amalekite king, and he also preserved their flocks and their herds for the Israelites. And God is enraged at Shaul and says, because you have not followed my command, the kingship will no longer continue through you, Shaul. And all because Shaul placed his own expediency and his own self-interest above the swift and clear acting out of a divine command, which represents creating the way for justice in the world. Yehuda Kurtzer wrote about this gesture in an article he wrote not long ago. He said, when we start making calculations and considerations in our moral behavior, seduced either by the general temptation not to act or by the usual suspects of wealth and power, we fail to live up to the moral obligations that are explicitly before us. Urgency gives way to an arbitrary calculus of values and needs. This is what happened in the story of Shaul. Shaul simply acted out of self-interest, and he preserved Agag, and the result was disastrous. Why do I say the result was disastrous? Well, that's why we have the holiday of Purim, right? How are we introduced to Haman? Haman is Haman ben I forget how to pronounce it. Oh, ben Hamdata Agagi, right? He is the descendant of Hamdata, the Agagi, a direct descendant of Agag, the Amalekite king whom Shaul did not kill, but he kept alive. Of course, this is all very vicious, blood-spilling kinds of stories. And we don't have to take these stories literally. I always teach this, that Torah and Tanakh is not meant to be read necessarily as a history book. Even if the character of Haman is ultimately a fictional character, it doesn't matter. What Haman and Amalek all stand for, what they are metaphors for, is this quality that lives in humanity. And when we don't wipe out Amalek, when we don't constantly fight against that tendency to sow division amongst our people, then it falls out of control through all time and all history and all human experience. Shaul didn't wipe out Agag, and therefore Amalek reappeared again generations later in Persia, in Persian garb, as Haman. And because Amalek has not been wiped out in this world, Amalek appears again in other garbs and in other forms. Amalek appeared on 9/11. Amalek appeared again on January 6th with the Capitol rioters. And yes, Amalek appeared yet again in the Senate vote last week. Now, I want to point out something very important. I am not, and I repeat, I am not suggesting that we follow the Torah's command to kill everybody whom we identify as Amalek. God forbid, no worries, I'm not saying that at all. What I'm saying is rather we follow the rabbinic interpretation of Amalek, that Amalek is this dark quality that lives in the hearts of all human beings, with no exception. Amalek lives in each and every one of us, even the Jewish people. And I can say this definitively because that is also what the Megillah that we're going to read next week attests to. Even we are capable of the same thing that Amalek was. You know how the story of the Megillah actually ends? We don't teach that to Hebrew school kids. It ends in a bloodbath, not wrought by the Persians, but by us. We take this incredible revenge against the Persians because of their genocidal aims toward us. And we have this celebratory bloodbath at the end of the story. And yes, it's deeply disturbing, and I think it's disturbing on purpose. The Megillah is a brilliant document. It's not just a silly, fun document. It's brilliant. It's there to give us pause about the fact that Amalek is not just about wiping out Haman and hanging Haman's 10 sons. It's about looking deep within ourselves and seeing that this tendency is alive even within each and every one of us. And we even see this concept in the famous custom of getting drunk on Purim. What do we say? It says you should get drunk ad delo yada ben Baruch Mordechai va'arur Haman. You should get drunk to the point where you can't even tell the difference between blessed is Mordechai and cursed is Haman. Now, many generations of rabbis and many of us don't think this is a very wise thing at all in Judaism. Getting drunk so that you can't distinguish between who is right and who is wrong sounds like a horrible idea. In fact, you see all kinds of rabbinic texts, even starting in the Talmud, that talk about how it's a horrible thing and it could lead to violence. And it talks about that in the Shulchan Aruch, how they try to go crazy to reinterpret it. And they say, well, no, you should get drunk ad delo yada. Up until the point you can't tell the difference. They're trying to reinterpret it. But we know what it really means. It means this blurring of the distinction between those who are conceived to be right and those who appear to be wrong in the story. Why? We get a brilliant explanation from the Sfat Emet, a Hasidic teacher, and he says the following: if you want to understand this idea of you can't distinguish between Haman and Mordechai, flip it upside down on its head. Yes, getting drunk is falling down very, very low. It's to go very low. It's the bottom of our moral character to never to be able to distinguish between right and wrong. But it also represents, if you flip it, and this is in good Purim theme, just flip everything upside down, it also can represent a spiritual realm beyond good and evil, to a place where there is only God, where there is only goodness, where there is only blessing or divine goodness, right? There's human ideas of goodness and there's God's idea of divine goodness. And he uses as his proof text the idea, remember Haman built a gallows to hang Mordechai on, right? That gallows, that tree, he refers to it as, is 50 cubits high. And the Sfat Emet explains, well, it's 50 cubits high because it corresponds first to the 49 measures of human impurity where there is the experience of good and evil, but then it adds 1 cubit to represent what's called the 50th gate. That's a Kabbalistic concept of divine unity beyond all, where God's goodness overwhelms everything else. So ad delo yada represents this act of coming into an awareness of this greater goodness that underlies all things. If this sounds hopelessly esoteric, you're right, it is hopelessly esoteric. But luckily, the Sfat Emet gives another metaphor that helps us understand what he's talking about. A little bit earlier in the book of Exodus, we read the story of Moses giving people the strength to fight against Amalek. It's the famous story of Moses keeping his arms up. Remember this story? The Israelites under Joshua are fighting against the Amalekites, and Moses lifts his hands up. And so long as Moses' hands are held high, the Israelites prevail against Amalek. But he's had to keep his hands up the whole time for the whole battle, and he got tired, and they had to prop up his arms to keep his arms up there so that they would always prevail, because God forbid he should lower them. Then Amalek would win. So what does this mean? The Sfat Emet says, you know what Moses was doing by keeping his arms up? He was pointing to that 50th gate, that esoteric Kabbalistic realm where only divine goodness lives, where there is no more Amalek. He was pointing us toward there and reminding us as we were struggling that place beyond Amalek is real. It lives in God, and God is directing us. And that gave them hope, and that gave them strength to fight on and ultimately to prevail. So what does all of this mean? Well, I believe that what we witnessed in the Senate a week ago was exactly King Saul's mistake. Out of the interest of self-interest and expediency, they let a dimension of Amalek go. And what that will result in now is a society where we continue to be not really safe. It's a society where this Amalek can continue to grow like a cancer as it grows throughout our human condition. That once again, there will be the Amalek now embodied in white supremacists and other kinds of white nationalist terrorists in this society who are emboldened to sow the seeds of violence and bigotry and hatred in this society, to divide us and tear us apart. Yes, we have our work cut out for us now, because justice, just as in the case of Saul, was not delivered swiftly and clearly and decisively and strongly as those like Congressman Jamie Raskin and the other amazing leaders of the impeachment argued so beautifully. That did not happen. So this is the moment when we think about our society and our world, when we remember that image of Moses with his hands up in the air, pointing to that 50th gate up there where there is no more Amalek in the world. Sound like a pipe dream? Certainly does when we look around at our society today. Something that we can even barely even imagine when we see the troubles that beset us in our world. But I want to point something out. Remember the effect of Moses pointing up there. Whenever he continued to remind us that there was there, that it's possible, then we were able to prevail. We did it. We did it then, and we can do it again. That's the promise that lives in that image of Moses pointing up. Amalek can be routed in this world and in our own hearts. It's always possible. You know, Yehuda Kurtzer in that same article pointed out something very powerful. This message is actually in the Maftir itself. It says, right, remember what Amalek did? And then it says you should blot out the memory. But he says, you know what? If you look very carefully at the words, you can't do it yet. We're not there yet, right? What did it say? It said, when Lord your God grants you safety from all your enemies around you, we don't have safety from all our, we can't blot out the memory of Amalek yet. We're not there. So what do we have to do now? Lo tishkach. Now our job is not to forget. Not to forget that Amalek is there. But I want to point out, based on all of these wonderful rabbinic and Hasidic teachings, that lo tishkach, don't forget, has a double meaning. It doesn't just mean don't forget all of the past violence and victimizations that we've had at the hands of the Amaleks throughout history. Lo tishkach also means remember that this is possible to overcome. Don't forget Moses with his hands up in the air. Don't forget God's promise that we can bring about peace and justice in our human condition. That potential lives in all of us. That's what's really behind this paradoxic saying, right, blot it out, but don't forget. It's teaching us that we should never give up on this struggle, no matter how impossible it seems. Never give up, never despair. Always know that we have this potential. This is what Purim is celebrating. This is why we're celebrating it. Because sometimes when you least expect it, you never know, it can happen. Right? So long as we know who we are, and we never forget that this world, this realm where Amalek disappears is always alive within us as well. May we be granted strength in this journey. May we remember that we're capable of this and we can do this. And may that time when Amalek is no more come speedily. Bimheira b'yameinu, speedily and in good time. And we all say, Amen.